Morning to you. It's a nice day here, and I was at my daughter's house and thought I'd say a few words about the will of God and reference a certain verse from the New Testament, Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 17, where the Apostle Paul says to the Ephesian Christians, "Do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is." Do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. That's quite a challenge when you think about it sometimes, to understand what the will of God is. In fact, oftentimes we get very confused about why things go the way they do and why God seems to allow certain things. And we say, certainly this can't be God's will for us or God's will for this world and the things that are going on. We look at wars and cataclysms and personal problems and accidents and all kinds of devastations, conflicts, death, sickness. And we say, this cannot be the will of God. Is it the will of God? Ever ask yourself that question? Is it the will of God that I be in this state? Is it the will of God that people are so poor so much of the time? Is it God's will that I can't pay my bills? Or you're laying in your chair and you're sick and in pain and you say, this can't be God's will. And then you hear someone say, who seems to represent Christianity, that this is never God's will for us to be sick. It's never God's will for us to be in financial straits or anything like that. It's never God's will to experience pain and suffering like we experience it, and we again get confused about these things so easily. I think there are two working categories that can help us to keep this a little more straightened out in our minds, a little clearer in our minds, and give some lucidity to the whole notion of God's will and our part in the whole scheme of things. That this is not unique to me. I didn't come up with this, but I frequently will refer to this in my own mind and thought in working out various things. And that is to think in terms of the perfect will of God and the permissive will of God. The perfect will of God and the permissive will of God. Now, these are not biblical expressions. You won't find those expressions anywhere in the scriptures. But the concepts, I think, are latent in the scriptures. They are there, and we have to work it through in our own minds and in our own studies. And what do I mean by the perfect will of God and the permissive will of God? Well, the perfect will of God is the ideal. This is God's order. This is God's original order of things, going all the way back to the first pages of the Bible in Genesis. You remember Eden, and it was this pastoral paradise, and it was wonderful and without pain and suffering, as the Bible describes it. It was perfect. And this is the will of God, ideally, perfectly. And one day it will be realized completely and forever, which is to say, perfectly speaking, war is never a part of God's plan. Perfectly speaking, it is never God's will that we ever be sick. God does not delight in sickness. He does not delight in seeing human beings suffer as they do. God is not a mean ogre who, again, somehow is pleased with pain and suffering and turmoil in people's lives. His perfect will for us is perfect health and peace always, and joy forevermore. His perfect will is that there be no conflict of any kind, internationally, nationally, even in our families, among our loved ones. no, no disturbance whatsoever. This is God's will. That you always be healthy, that you always be happy, that you always be completely satisfied in it, one with things and one with other people. No disharmony, but perfect harmony. An irenic scene, peaceful. That is his perfect will. However, again, when you read through the Bible, and you don't have to go very far, you realize that people have turned away from God and even to this day refuse to submit to God's authority and law, his word. The vast majority of people who claim to be Christians never, or very seldom at least, read the Bible, which would indicate they're not really interested in what God has to say about things, not really interested. And of course, those who make no claim to follow Jesus have no interest in, any real interest, I should say, in God's laws and his declarations, following them. They don't wish to submit to Jesus and his authority as King and Lord. But again, this is the ideal, though, that there be a perfect world. But we, because of our sin and rebellion, refuse to go along with that. And according to, again, the Bible, with our rebellion comes what is known as the fall, which is the moral collapse of humanity, which has brought untold suffering, immeasurable pain to the human race, and in some sense has had rippling effects all throughout the cosmos. We can't understand these things. These are spiritual, metaphysical assertions that the Bible makes, but because of man's rebellion against God, tidal waves have gone out and affected everything, just like a tsunami. So the perfect will of God, again, is that all things be right and straight and perfect and true. But the permissive will of God is what I was already alluding to, and that is the pain and suffering that we experience. God permits cancer. God permits car accidents. God permits divorce, death, dying, and everything difficult to live with in life, sometimes seemingly impossible to live with. God permits those things. Now, it would take quite a while to even begin to go into the problem of evil and how do we reconcile this with a loving, all-powerful God. But suffice it to say that this is something clearly told to us in the scriptures, that he allows affliction and agony. But in all of it, he remains God. He remains loving. And he is working out his divine purposes in our lives. And this is where we, who call ourselves Christians, have to trust God. We say, why can't it just be your perfect order all the time? Well, the play is already underway. Everything is in motion. And so we have to trust God in the mix of it all, in the whirl. If you remember at the end of the book of Job, it says that God spoke to Job, who was in intense suffering all throughout the book practically. It says that God spoke to him in the whirlwind. That always intrigued me when I would come across that, because it is a whirlwind, it is a great whirl. Ecclesiastes makes reference to this in the Old Testament about The wind's blowing round and round and round. The water's rushing to the sea, but the sea is never full. Everything is in motion. You know, when you look again at even at the planets constantly swirling and orbiting the star, their appropriate star. The whole galaxy swirling round and round. Everything is in motion, and we are in the mix of it all. But we have to trust God. I guess if I have any word of perhaps encouragement or advice to all of us today, it's to trust God in the midst of all that is imperfect. Because God is still God. As A.W. Tozer said, a great man of God of a century ago, he said, God is behind all, above all, before all. God is always there. Be encouraged today. Have a good day. Have a good week this week. And I welcome your comments and your likes and all of that stuff too. Thank you.